Well, I wanted to welcome you all. Susan and I both want to welcome you to the third and final planned session of our journey together and Planning Commission training. And I just wanted to commend you, whether you've been here for all three sessions or this is your first session, it takes a big commitment to spend your Wednesday or Thursday, Thursday evening
2
for
hours.
2 hours to learn about planning and zoning. So I really commend you that you are not only volunteering to serve your community as a planning commissioner, but you're also committing additional free time to going through this training process. So yay for you. And we've made it to the final session, but of course our partnership doesn't end tonight. And at the end of this presentation, we'll talk about any ideas or special things you have that you want to work on in the future. So with that being said, tonight's session is going to focus on a few topics that we have not covered yet. We're going to wrap up what we started in the last session on processes. If you recall, session 2 was all about processes, how to apply your zoning ordinances, your use table to real life scenarios. And what we talked about was things like, what can I do with my property and where can I put my business? And part of the session tonight is going to be an extension of that conversation when we delve into the exciting world of subdivision. Then we're going to talk about 3 special topics: annexation, flood prevention, and historic districts. And following that, we'll talk about everything you need to know to protect yourself as a planning commissioner, protect your integrity, and help things run smoothly at your meetings. So Susan has a lot of experience with those topics and has served on a planning commission before, so she's going to impart her knowledge and her experience on those topics. So feel free to, of course, as always, ask questions throughout, because we do have a full agenda. If there's a question that requires a longer answer, we might just note it and then follow up via email, but please always feel free to ask that question, chime in, hold down your space bar and chime in, or you can also put something in the chat if you want. So let's start with introductions. What I kind of teased you in my email this morning was that we're going to be asking you your name. I forgot to think of 3. I wrote mine down. We're going to ask you your name, of course, and then 3 qualities of your ideal neighborhood. And we'll start to just give you some time to think. So since Susan is still writing, I'll go ahead and start with mine. So my name is Bernadette Rhodes. I am a community planner with Metro Plan. I've been here for almost 6 months. Previous to that, I worked for the city of North Little Rock for 9 years, including on some planning and zoning projects. And my ideal neighborhood would be, number 1, safe. Safe both from crime, but also from things like fast traffic, careless drivers, and safe for walking and bicycling for my children especially. The second quality would be clean and attractive. And the third quality would be well connected to a variety of things that make me happy. So the things that make me happy in my neighborhood are other neighbors, the nice ones, schools, my kids' schools, food, both grocery and restaurants, and the ability to walk and bike around my neighborhood. So well connected is my third quality of an ideal neighborhood. How about you, Susan?
Riffing off of that, my ideal neighborhood is one that is walkable with destinations, places where I want to go. I wrote front porch. That just goes toward the whole idea of neighborliness. And I'm fortunate enough to live in a neighborhood where we can get out on our front porch when it's warm, and people will come by and we'll talk. That's nice. Multi-generational. I think a neighborhood that has amenities for people with very young children and for retirees and young professionals, everybody in between. I think that really makes a good, vibrant neighborhood. So that's That's mine.
All right, now it's your turn. Mayor Reed, I'm going to pick on you. Can you tell us 3 qualities of your ideal neighborhood?
That's fine. And if you don't click your Zoom window, your space bar will run down all of your Outlook addresses at the same time too. So I'm learning all types of tricks to this trick. What's my ideal neighborhood? It's a fun question. My mind goes to like South Carolina, Columbus, Mississippi. You know, I can start with what my ideal neighborhood is not, and that's cookie cutter, where you see a lot of sprawl neighborhoods. And because I've lived in one of these, I lived in 1,300 square foot home, freshly built, that had, you know, 0.4 acres to it and a small backyard, and everybody had a fence, and we were all the same, you know, on top of each other, and we were 12 feet apart from our neighbor, and everybody had the same house colors and everything. So there was not a lot of I lived in the back too, so when I entered into my neighborhood, I drove past, I felt like I was in a hall of houses. It was all the same colors, you know, and you're just going up down the drainage ditches to get your house. And so to me, I like variety. The first thing I wrote down was pedestrian scaled. So the sidewalks are scaled, the landscapes are scaled, the lighting is scaled. That's something that I like in a neighborhood. I like to see patriotism. I love to see American flags hanging, and I love to see some sense of unity where neighbors are sharing a sense of pride between each other. Maybe that doesn't have to be a flag or a banner. Maybe it's like we have now, the garbage cans, where on garbage day everybody has the same colored garbage can out, and it ties each house to each other. Maybe it's as simple as the address mnemonic, where you have, what do they call that? The first response, your address moniker is mimicked similarly between each different house and clearly defined. I don't know if I gave you 3 or not, but those are the 2 that I've referenced that I would say I appreciate and pick up when I'm looking at different types of neighborhoods.
Well, thank you, Mayor. All right, Miss Karen, how about you? I guess we already know y'all's names, so just go ahead and name 3 qualities of your ideal neighborhood, and you're gonna have to unmute yourself.
Okay, my ideal neighborhood would be clean, with the yards well manicured. You know, everybody keeps their yards nice and clean and mowed and weed eated and stuff, and quiet. And that goes for people and for traffic. And I would want low traffic. I wouldn't want to live on a busy street. I'd want to be able to, you know, go outside and walk down the street and not have to worry about a bunch of, you know, a bunch of traffic. So those are my 3 qualities.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Jones, how about you? What are 3 qualities in your ideal neighborhood? And you'll have to unmute yourself. Let's see, you're still muted. Can you, I can ask to unmute. I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, we can't hear you right now. Do you know how to unmute yourself? Go down to where there's a microphone and click unmute. Well,
The little icon there.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Oh, that was the video. Now go next to it on the microphone icon. And it's probably struck through and it's red right now, and click on that and do unmute. I'll let you know. It's still not working yet. You know what? Keep. There you
Okay,
go.
anyway.
There it is.
Okay.
Hear you now.
Okay.
Sorry about that, but I'm not too familiar with the Zoom process. Actually, it's probably my second time Zooming.
It's a learning curve for
So
sure.
you guys will have to be patient with me there.
Oh yeah.
And of course, you already know my name there. Of course, it's Mike Jones. I've been on the planning committee for I believe less than a year, so I'm still in the learning stage of it. But three things that ideal things that I would like to see is one would be safety. I think I just would like a city that's free from crime and that. And second one would be lighting, efficient lighting all over the city, so that if you're out at night and stuff, that there's no dark spots in it and stuff. And the street signs and stuff, I would like to, for Lonoke, especially to get, up to date on it, where the portion of the city that I live in, we are got the old type of city things where you got a concrete pillow with a name on it, and they're faded out and stuff. So if you were looking for someone in the dark, there's no way that you could find the street that they live on or the house or anything. So I would like for, the city to be unique in street signs.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense for safety and emergency response as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right.
Okay,
Great.
Bill Cooley just sent me a text and said he's been trying to connect, but it says that there's no connection.
Oh no. Well, if he can't connect via Zoom, he could possibly dial in, and he wouldn't necessarily be able to see the slides, but he could hear.
I don't see
Well,
that
hopefully
there.
he'll be able
See, I did Trey's little trick, and then I'll let go of the space bar. Okay, it says unstable connection. Do you think that means his internet is not strong enough or whatever?
It could be that his internet's not strong enough. Sometimes when you try to turn on your video, it takes up too much bandwidth. So he could try joining without video and see if that makes a difference. He'd still be able to see us. We just wouldn't be able to see him. All right. Well, Mr. Bailey, would you like to share what your 3 ideal qualities would be? And you'll have to unmute yourself. There you go. Oh, there. We're good.
Well, I like one of the main things that depends on if it's a subdivision neighborhood, just all of us having good streets, good lighting, and sidewalks. And also, I think that because you're subdividing, they had to have a property owners committee so they can communicate themselves to each other, and the spokesperson going to the city council. That's all I do. Okay, here you go. Sure more new.
Hey, Bernadette, you guys are muted.
Where's my space bar? Okay. Yep, sure was. I'm sorry, Mr. Bailey. So what we heard you say was streets with proper signalization and lighting and sidewalks. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, well, that's subdivision type. We have property owners committed with the property owners talk to each other and once in a while we carry something from them to the city to a bunch of everything.
Okay, thank you. All right, so that leaves us with welcoming Jeremy to the fold. How are you doing? And Jeremy, if you'll unmute yourself, we're sharing the 3 qualities of our ideal neighborhood.
Yes, okay, and sorry for my tardiness. I couldn't find the link to come in, but I found it anyway. Or actually, the mayor had to send it to me again. I look at it from a slightly different perspective, I guess, being an architect, but I like neighborhoods to all neighborhoods to have public space because it brings the neighbors together, so you have gets you a better sense of community. Boulevards are nice. I like that too.
That was my 3rd one too, Jeremy. I just didn't write it down.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if you've ever been to Savannah, Georgia, that's one of the coolest places because like every 3 blocks, the center of the block is a park. And it's just an amazing thing that, you know, not every city can have something like that, but it's really nice to have community space.
It's past language.
Second thing for me is, well, I did say boulevards. That could be second. I don't know. That's kind of, I just like that. Second for me is that no spec houses. You know, you don't have one house and 3 houses down, there's a house that looks exactly like it. That just bothers me. Ingenuity, you know, everybody have a house that's different from everywhere else. And then 3, and this kind of goes back to, in a sense, public spaces. I really like cul-de-sacs because I grew up in a cul-de-sac and that was where we played ball every day. And it's safer because you only come up on those streets unless you got a reason to. And so it's the same thing in a way of public space, you know, I mean, baseball is one of my favorite sports and cul-de-sacs are perfect places for it. So I kind of love cul-de-sacs. So that's my 3, maybe 4. I don't know. I'm count them.
Sorry, we won't hold you to it. Thank you, Jeremy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you all for sharing that. That is really good. And I like that you mentioned places that you especially appreciate the atmosphere of, because that gives us ideas when we start to think of, oh, where could we take the board next for a fact-finding trip? It's good to hear those cities that you particularly admire. So let's spend just a few minutes reviewing what we covered last session and then answering any questions that might still be lingering in your minds from that session. But in the last session, which was back last year, the year that we'd all like to forget as soon as possible, but hopefully you still recall a few things that we talked about. We talked about land use, answering the question of where can I put my business with permitted uses. And we talked about land development, answering the question, what can I do with my property? So we talked about the development codes, the lot standards that are in your Unified Development Ordinance, and we talked about how to get a building permit. And then we talked about all the processes that are a little bit outside of the norm, things like conditional uses, variances, and rezoning. And I just pulled up this building permit process slide because it dovetails nicely into what we're going to get into next, which is subdivision. But before I do that, is there anything that's still on your mind from last session that perhaps we need to delve more into or need to cover? Okay. Well, with the building permits, we talked about how, you know, the process, the application, the site plan review, the professional survey that needs to be submitted to the city administrator. And then we talked about commercial buildings, how they require a little bit more. They require the health department review letter for the plumbing and the state fire marshal review letter. And the city administrator, i.e. Jeremy, can issue small and medium scale building permits that meet the regulations. So if everything checks out, you go down the checklist and everything's there, and all the regulations are met, it's pretty easy to get a building permit. Of course, you know, if you're in an overlay, there are some stipulations in your development code about the planning commission reviewing that development proposal. But what if the property has never been developed before? So it's a new subdivision or a brand new commercial development. Or what if it's a really large scale development? Then that triggers part 2 of the question, what can I do with my property? And that is all about subdivision and plat approvals. So part 2. And when we go through this whole process of getting a subdivision approved and put into place and constructed, built out, we want to, of course, cover the process, but we also want to cover with you and talk a little bit about the why. Why are subdivision regulations in place at all? Then how does the process work? And also some key considerations that you on a staff side and a planning commissioner side would want to keep in mind as you are evaluating these proposals. So people who are looking at subdividing are going to have a few key questions. They're going to want to know, how do I get a building permit? How can I start, how do I get to the point where I can start building houses on this land? How can I develop this property? And what kinds of improvements am I going to have to pay for? And side note, they might want to pay for as little as possible because of course everything costs a ton of money. So your UDC, Unified Development Code, answers, or UDO, I'm sorry, Unified Development Ordinance answers these questions. And you have a lot of great forms on your website that have helpful checklists of things to go through, the process to follow for getting something like this approved. So we know developers have these questions. They want them answered as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But like everything else, the purpose of having these regulations in place in the first place is the same reason that you have your zoning ordinance in place and your use table, is to protect the public interest. So it really ties in nicely with everything else you're tasked with to protect residents and property owners, both in the present and the future. Because any kind of new subdivision or large scale development that is put in has an impact on the viability of existing and future developments and infrastructure. So by carefully reviewing proposals for subdivisions and carefully reviewing plats, you are protecting the future owners and occupants of this newly developed land from any kind of unhealthy, unsafe, or inadequate developments. And then the part that's in the city's best interest, because, as we've talked about before, your first job is to protect the city and to serve the city as a whole, is to prevent current and future residents or taxpayers from footing the bill. So one example of that might be a subdivision, a road is put into a subdivision built new by the developer. If that road is not built correctly, it could fail in a matter of years, short years, not for 30 years, but maybe 3 or less sometimes. And then it's not just the people who built properties on that, so in that subdivision, who are going to foot the bill for fixing the road. It's the entire city. All the taxpayers are going to foot that bill. So it's really in the city's best interest to make sure that the subdivision ordinance is followed correctly. And so what kind of instances trigger the subdivision ordinance? The conversion of vacant land into any kind of urban, and when we say urban, that just means urbanized, developed residential, commercial, or industrial use, or if you're changing lot lines. And then there are some stipulations in your code about large-scale developments triggering some of this subdivision process. So we're going to talk about next, how do you get from idea to permit? What boxes do you need to check? And the first step in that is determining what type of subdivision you're dealing with. Thankfully, since subdivision is kind of a complex process, there is a standard subdivision, which starts on page 65 of your UDO, and then there are incidental subdivisions. So for those smaller type things like a lot split where you're splitting one property in 2 parts, a minor subdivision that has less than 5 lots, a lot recombination, a replat or a lot line adjustment, or just the conversion of a older meets and bounds description into a subdivision plat that is suitable for filing at the Lonoke County Recorder's Office. Any kind of changes like that can be handled through the incidental subdivision process, which is on page 81 and is a lot simpler than your standard subdivision process. So keep that in mind. I think Ms. Ibbotson had sent me an example of a barber shop that did this recently, where they combined 2 lots into one. And so that was a fairly straightforward, easy process. So we won't go into too much detail on the process for that. What we're going to focus on is your standard subdivision that that we might face that takes a little bit more of a complicated process. And for large-scale developments, we're talking, and this is based on your code, that an expansion of a building by greater than 1/3 of its original size is considered a large-scale development. A change to how the property is accessed is considered a large-scale development, and anything that's over 15,000 square feet or on 2 or more acres, that's a non-residential development, or a residential development with 4 or more dwelling units is considered a large-scale development and would trigger this process. So what's the process a developer has to go through? The first and very important step is also the most informal. It's the pre-application conference with the city administrator, also known as a sketch plan. And this is where the developer sits down, pretty much with their idea. They might have some plans sketched out already. Maybe they've already gotten an engineer involved, maybe not. But they're kind of sketching out, here's my property, here's what I'm thinking of doing with it. And they're getting with the city administrator saying, does this fit? Is this a viable idea? And what Jeremy might sit down and discuss with them is, let's check the other documents that we have, our general plan, our zoning code. Does this coordinate? Does this fit in with that? They'd be looking at lot configurations. How are the lots going to be configured? What kind of roads need to go in? What kind of drainage concerns are there? Water, sewer, is that pre-existing or will that need to be installed? Utilities, will those need to be extended into the neighborhood? What sidewalks are required? Are there any public uses or reservation of open space that's required? So kind of going through all of those criteria and figuring out what they might be leaving out or what they might need to consider. So that's kind of their vetting of the idea. And then you move on to preliminary plat, and that is a formal application that the developer fills out and files at least 20 days before the planning commission that they want to consider that. And it's called a preliminary plat, but it's really not very preliminary, because by that point, they've already had conversations with Jeremy. They know what they need to do, and they're getting an engineer involved in drawing out an official proposed plat that they want to use to initiate construction of the subdivision. So once that passes planning commission, it is approved for construction. Jeremy can start issuing building permits for building out this development. If it meets all the requirements of the UDO, approve it. That's a very straightforward approval. And typically the staff report that you get from Jeremy will say, all these things are checked, all these things are met. Now, if there's something that's different, that requires a variance, the planning commission can require changes. And of course, does anyone remember what an exception to the development standards is called? Variance. And we talked about that in the last session. So we'll see in these examples we're about to show you what that developers do ask for variances, and then that's of course up to you to either grant or not grant. And we talked about all the considerations in our last session about what to look out for when considering a variance. Precedent and consistency being the top two. So that is, oh, and then we have the construction that occurs. And then once the construction is complete, the developer submits a final plat to the Planning Commission for the Planning Commission to officially approve it. And that triggers the recording in the county records. And basically you are issuing a certificate that says, yes, developer, you did everything that you said you were going to do. It's all good. You're done. Your job here is done. You can move on to your next project. And that's a very big step, because then everything gets recorded and it becomes officially part of the county records. Okay, so in going through this process, what are some of the things that you need to consider when evaluating a subdivision proposal? Certainly land suitability, and we'll talk about when we talk about flood prevention, we'll touch on the floodplain issues. Topography is an issue. The adequacy of public facilities. Can this land be served by communal water, communal sewer, or drainage facilities? Or do some other provisions need to be made? Or is it just not suitable for development because it can't be served by those utilities? Access. Is it currently served by public streets? If not, streets will need to be created to serve this area. And conformance to municipal plans, we mentioned, it needs to conform to all of your planning documents, the master street plan, the UDC, and your building codes. So all of these things need to be checked. And this comment is kind of accurate. I mean, there are definitely subdivisions that have gone in the past few years where they're already having to repave and redo the streets because they're just falling apart and having pothole after pothole. So we don't want that to happen to you. Because once you accept those final improvements that the developer did, it's yours. It's yours to take care of, for better or worse. So some subdivision, continuing with the considerations, you of course want to consider the impacts on surrounding and downstream properties, because not only is this development going to be impacted with what they put in there, but all the surrounding areas. And of course, your job is to protect everybody's property values and everybody's land viability. And so, especially with stormwater runoff and considerations like that, you want to make sure that they're not putting anything upstream that's going to negatively impact developments and neighborhoods downstream, because that has definitely happened where one subdivision has caused then flooding issues and drainage issues in another pre-existing subdivision because there wasn't the right drainage put in. The quality of public improvements, making sure that everything that they're putting in, from streets to sidewalks to utility easements, is up to snuff. The long-term maintenance cost, this is a huge one, and who will pay? Again, protect the city, protect your investment in your sewers, in your streets. Make sure that the subdivision is going to bring in the revenue to you in property taxes and new residents that will make this investment worth it. So think long-term. Connectivity, street layout, traffic impacts. If a new subdivision goes in, I think Worcester is a good example of this. They've had a lot of subdivisions to the north of the city. And now, when people come south from their subdivision south to hit the interstate to go to work, they're having tremendous traffic problems and they're getting mad. And so, that's a consideration. How is the impact on traffic going to work out? And, what are your block lengths going to be? Are you going to have cul-de-sacs in your subdivision? And if so, how will they be connected? How long will they be? Will they have other connections to other streets? And are you going to provide pathways, or are you going to require pathways out of some of those streets? So for example, one thing that we're looking into and learning a lot about is ensuring connectivity within subdivisions. And I agree, cul-de-sacs are great. I personally live on a circle, And I really like that there's not a lot of traffic there for when my kids are out there riding their bikes in the street. But what are some of the pathways out? What we want to avoid is, having two cul-de-sacs that back up against each other, and then you have to go all the way around just to get to the other side of that cul-de-sac. And so we're looking at some options for, requiring bicycle or pedestrian pathways, just kind of some of those, not even paved, but trails or multi-use pathways to connect some of those neighborhoods better.
I was going to say, a neighborhood in Jacksonville, Stonewall, has the traditional not cookie cutter, but cul-de-sac, but they're all connected with paved paths and lighted paths for pedestrians and bikes. So that is one way that you can increase the neighborhood connectivity.
Mm-hmm. So there are lots of creative options for that. So that's one thing to consider when looking at a new subdivision. And then of course, easements and right-of-way, making sure you capture the right-of-way through this process that's going to be necessary to serve the city both now and in the future, in case any kind of road widening needs to occur or utilities need to be put in, making sure that you capture that right-of-way up front so that you don't run into a situation later on where you're having to negotiate or purchase right-of-way from private property owners, which is very expensive and cumbersome.
So there's a neighborhood in Cabot that there's an older part of the neighborhood, and then a developer went in and started putting in newer homes. And I'm not sure, how it all worked, but he put a street in to connect the older neighborhood, like in the middle of the neighborhood. And the city made him block that street off. So if you're driving down one street, if you turn, there's like a big fence or whatever in the middle of the street where you can't turn on that street, because the neighbors in the older neighborhood, the people, threw a fit. We don't want all this traffic coming down our street. And so the city did make them block that off to where you can't drive into, you have to still drive through the neighborhood, but it's just one street, but you couldn't come into the little side streets of the older neighborhood.
You talking about Newberry Court?
No, I'm talking about Sun Terrace over off Rockwood by Walmart, on the other side of the highway from Walmart.
That's in Cabot?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Karen, I was thinking here when you're talking about the fence over the road, because we have that at Newberry Court, right?
Oh, we do. Yeah, we do have that at Newberry Court. No, this is over on Sun Terrace. It's across from Walmart off Rockwood.
That's really interesting. And I completely understand why people wouldn't want new traffic coming through their neighborhood. And that kind of drives home the argument for connectivity, because if ideally you would have several exit points from a subdivision, not just one, so that not all that traffic would have to go through there. It could disperse and go, through more of a grid, which is the beauty of the grid system. If one street's blocked, no big deal, you go somewhere else. So that is certainly a consideration when looking at subdivisions. How is everyone going to get out? How many exits are there out of this subdivision?
Yeah, I've seen that a lot in Cabot, where developers go in and buy vacant land, and they think they can just go in and use an existing street or whatever. And there's one over, I can't remember the subdivision. Anyway, there's, probably 30 homes, and they're older homes, and a man went in and bought this property next to them. He was going to put in another, 35, 40 houses. And these other houses are like, $200,000 to $300,000 houses. And he's looking at putting in, 1,300 square foot houses. And there's one way in and one way out. And all the neighbors in that subdivision just threw a fit. They had a special meeting with the city council and everything. And they wound up putting in those houses, and there is literally one way in. There is one street in. And the property values, once they did that, the property values just kind of went down.
Yeah, and everyone's concerned about their property values, and rightfully so. It's the single biggest investment a lot of people make in their lives. And you do, when you have a poorly connected community, you get a lot of NIMBYism, like not in my backyard. And because to them, growth is bad. You know, they want to live there, but they don't want anyone else living there because that just makes more traffic and more, you know, crowdedness. Whereas in a well-connected community, growth is not necessarily bad because it can disperse better and not competing for asphalt the same way you are if you all live off one long road, right? So that's
I think my dad was a NIMBY.
What's that?
I think my dad must have been a NIMBY.
A NIMBY. Yeah. There are
That's
lots
funny.
of NIMBYs.
I've never heard that one. I'm gonna keep it though in my mind. I've heard of the cave people, but I've never heard of the NIMBY, and I like it. You know, I learned a hard lesson in the first 3 months of lots of hard lessons in the first couple months as mayor, but one of which was I presented just a conceptual idea of connecting Mallard Point with the rail trail. Okay, we were discussing some drainage considerations that we've since remediated. And it was a town hall session with myself and the alderman at the time, who also was brand new. And we held the meeting to open air grievance and discuss drainage problems and what have you. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity to kind of fill the audience out on the potential plan of connecting them with a path to the rail trail. So you literally could walk down the street, get on the path, and go 2 miles to the baseball park in our city, and then walk back to your house. I probably got one of the most visceral receptions that I've had as a mayor on that because of the NIMBYism that we don't want to be open and connected to what you want us to be. It was maybe I didn't deliver it, so I'll take some fault on that. Maybe it wasn't my delivery, but it was more of a charrette sketch. It wasn't a proposal. It was just, here's what I'm thinking, guys. How cool would it be if you could hop on a bicycle and ride down to the ballpark and whatnot. So, but it's as much perception as it is reality. And
Yeah.
and the seed isn't going to take if the soil's not ready for it.
Yeah.
Right.
And go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
It's also harder when it gets put in after the fact, because then people are usually having to give up part of their yards to punch the trails or the pathway through. But what's interesting is that when it's built into a subdivision, it becomes an asset. And actually, in a newsletter Metroplan has just published about connectivity, it talks about the Overbrook Trail in North Little Rock. And back decades ago, when it was platted out, it was platted with a trail and access from certain parts of the neighborhood into the trail. And I talked to the alderman there the other day, and he said in his years and years as alderman, he's never heard a single complaint about that trail, and people love it, and their kids go on it, and they just are the biggest fans. And but they bought into the neighborhood knowing it was there, and they saw that as an asset versus something that's being forced on them. So you're right. I mean, it's all about the perception and kind of the timing of it, and the public acceptance and desire for it.
I think some people, there's a perception that having people from the outside biking or walking, that can somehow contribute to crime. And studies show that really that's not true. And in fact, the more people that you have where they belong on a pathway or on a sidewalk is a deterrent, because they're where they're supposed to be. People who are up to no good, they don't want you to be looking at them. And but I think that the perception though is there, that somebody can bike up to my house, and so I mean that's just something that you have to deal with, is that perception.
All right. So real world example. I have two examples from North Little Rock that were provided to me by the planning director there. And one of them is residential, one of them is commercial. And what I like about these examples is that it really gives you some key things to look out for. It's going to show you what the communication from the developer looked like when it came in, and they're usually communicating via their engineer. So the both letters that I'll show you came from the engineering firm that did the plat. And then it shows you the review process that they went through and how many stakeholders were involved in that, because it's really interesting just how many people were able to give input into that proposal. It has the staff report that summarizes all the recommendations, and I believe these staff reports are put together by the assistant planning director, and they're very well done. So I wanted to show those to you. And then also their process involves meeting with the developer before that planning commission meeting, where the planning commission is going to either approve or deny the preliminary plat. And so there's no surprises. I like how well they communicate with the developer throughout. They show them the staff report and the recommended conditions. And so a lot of times when I was looking through the minutes of the final approval of the plat, it said, you know, so and so stated they met with in their subdivision subcommittee, they met with the developer, and he or she has already agreed to all the conditions. Well then, hey, I mean, that's an easy approval for the planning commission. The developer agreed to all the conditions, they're ready to go, okay, and then they went ahead and approved it. So there were not a lot of surprises. There was not a lot of, you know, any kind of uncertainty. So I wanted to just walk you through two of the examples that North Little Rock provided. This is a fairly small, it's a portion of a larger subdivision, White Oak Village in North Little Rock. Here's where it's located. It's up northwest of Burns Park, kind of towards Maumelle, Crystal Hill Road area. And the 4 lots that they were platting are these 4 with the stars on them. So right on the corner of Prospect Trail and White Oak Drive. And so you can see it's kind of an undeveloped area of a larger subdivision. And if you guys can see this here, this is an excerpt from the original letter coming from the engineer. And I highlighted the part where in the letter it says, we're asking for a variance of the sidewalk requirements. I guess what they mean is we don't want to put in sidewalks. And the 25-foot front building setback, they want to change down to 15 feet. Okay. So, and then they submitted this preliminary plat. And then they require that the plat list the zoning requirements. So I just pulled those out. This is an R1 zone area. And the plat itself says what the setbacks are, et cetera, the minimum lot area. So right there on the plat, it's supposed to say, you know, what are the requirements for this zone. Then this is an excerpt of the staff report. And what I'd like to do is just pull up the whole staff report so I can find it in all my files here. So all windows, there we go. White Oak Village. There we go. So these are the minutes of the planning commission meeting where they actually included all the requirements that the planning department suggested. And I just wanted to show this to you so you can see how many stakeholders were involved in this. First of all, there's the engineering department, or some cities have an engineer on contract who reviews the plats. And so the engineer has their own checklist that they go through, and they're looking at drainage, and they're looking at the subdivision requirements as far as putting in public improvements. So they said, well, there's a mandatory on-site detention requirement here, but there's also a stipulation in their code that if you don't want to put in on-site detention, you can pay an in lieu fee of $500 per acre. So since they didn't have on-site detention listed on their plat, well, you have to pay the in lieu fee. So that's one. Yes, you do have to provide a sidewalk. So they did not choose to provide a variance on that. So go ahead, so give us something new that has a sidewalk. And then the planning requirements show that what format the plat has to be submitted in. And they're very specific about that. And I expect that helps them further down the line as they're submitting to the county recorder, you know, putting it into the Pulaski area GIS. It's, they need that in that format to make it all accurate. They have to provide utility and drainage easements and a sewer easement. They have to provide an average slope of the lots per their subdivision ordinance. So I like how it ties everything back to, you know, what their regulations are, because they have a hillside regulation, so they have to provide a letter from the city engineer that the plat meets the requirements of the hillside regulation. So it's saying, it's just checking everything that they've submitted against the existing planning documents and codes to make sure that nothing gets forgotten. Then additional community planning requirements provide the standard requirements of the regulations. Then master street plan, it's holding them to the 5-foot sidewalk requirement and the 5-foot buffer requirement. And then it refers to the screening and landscaping ordinance. It refers to the fire marshal, and it refers to Central Arkansas Water. So every single stakeholder is getting the opportunity to review this plat and say, here's what needs to happen for this to get approved. And then the planning director does a great job of tying it all together and making this list. And down here at the bottom, you can see where it says, Mr. Chambers, who's one of the planning commissioners, stated the applicant met with the Development Review Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Planning Commission, and has agreed to all their requirements. There were no additional comments, and the motion passed with 7 affirmative votes. So very, you know, when we're going to talk about meeting management later on. So, you know, very, very straightforward, very clearly stated what the requirements are going to be.
So I want to say something. In this situation, way I understand Lonoke would handle this, Jeremy would field the request. He would accept the letter of variance. He would vet it and scrub it and then present it to the planning commission, because for us, this is a large scale development. And he would state the user's requests, and the planning commission then would have the week prior. I can't remember what the turn-in date is. It's the, Karen, what is it? When you submit a large scale development, it's like 30 days prior. You have to have it submitted, I think, before the next planning commission meeting. So that, because we don't have a review board, that the planning commissioner, Karen and Jeremy, can sit down and discuss it. Do I understand that correctly, Jeremy and Karen?
Yeah, I think it has to be turned in by the 1st of the month, I think is the way that goes. Yeah, my thought on it is any problems I see beforehand will be addressed before it goes to the planning committee meeting. Because that way I'm doing is, like you said, I'm kind of scrub it and clean it up a little bit, so I don't have to bring to the planning commission something that it's obviously needs to be changed anyway.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Thanks, Bernadette. Didn't mean to.
No, thank you for clarifying that process. Sorry, I'm getting back to my slide. Having Zoom issues.
I just want to make sure I'm clear in my head. We haven't, as far as I've been here, I don't think we haven't had a subdivision plat, have we, Karen? Danny Whitehurst is the last one I remember. That was, I think he already had all the lots and everything though approved. It was just something else was. Anyways, I don't think we've had anybody come to the city since I've been here and say, we want to build a subdivision. Here it is. Go. We haven't had that yet. So.
No, we haven't.
And since this applies to also commercial buildings over 15,000 square feet, you know, you might get some of that down the line where you have commercial development that has to go through a similar process.
And we did have to approve the new education center that's going in on Highway 70.
And was that a site plan review?
Yes. Did you say a site plan review?
Yeah, site plan.
Yes.
winning, an education center?
Oh,
Is that part
Yeah,
of
the
the?
Lonoke School District is building a education center east of Lonoke on Highway 70, and there was an issue that we had to work out because part of the property is in the city limits and part is not. So we had to, that was a hurdle that we had to traverse.
Was that a small annexation that needed to happen?
They are, I think, Trey, is this right? They're going to annex, I think, part of that. The way we kind of got around it is there are no buildings being built outside the city limits, so it can still be serviced by city services, police, fire departments, that sort of thing won't be going out of the city limits. So, and, city water and sewer and that sort of thing, but that's kind of how we got around it, and it was approved. But I think they're in the process. I think they've applied for annexation. Is that right, Trey?
I don't know where it's at, but yeah, I do know the school had to apply to annex. I think it was like 30 feet, but it was like 90 feet, 120 feet long by like 30 feet wide. And it was an entryway coming into the parking lot, and there were some utilities I think that came in off that easement or something. I don't have the details in mind because I've slept a couple times since then, but yes, they did have to work through that, and that's something that we had to work together, remind them, hey, it looks like a portion of your plan is actually hanging out of the city limit. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. Well, I don't either. So let's ask the right questions now. And I don't think it was easy for the school. Annexation was not just a simplified process, I think it was relatively simple compared to what most annexations could be, but this one might have been, but it still was a little bit of a booger in the process for them.
They can be, and Susan's going to go over annexations a little bit later. But yeah, there are always those special things that you never anticipate happening. The next example is a commercial subdivision and site plan review for a tropical smoothie on Maumelle Boulevard. This is the location. It's right by the Walmart, which everybody thinks is in Maumelle, but it's actually North Little Rock city limits. Yay for North Little Rock taxes. and so this letter from the engineer is requesting a preliminary plat approval and a site plan approval at the same time of a new cafe, so new construction. And I like how much detail it gives with, it's going to have drive-through, parking, landscaping, exterior dining patio. It explains how the dumpster will be provided and screened. It talks about how no new driveways off of Maumelle Boulevard will be created, which is important for access management. It talks about how that lot will be accessed via a shared access easement, which is always a good idea. And hours of operation, it lists those as well. So it's really a nice detailed letter that they received there. And I hope you guys can see this okay, but this is the plat, and then on the left, and then the site plan on the right. And I will send these cases to you so you can look at the actual PDFs and get a good close-up view at them and see what all they include. They're not easy to read. I mean, you really almost have to be an engineer or an architect like Jeremy to make good sense of this, and that's why you have people like Jeremy on staff who are going to review this and translate it for you and pick up on any problematic things that they might see. And that's also why it's crucial to have an engineer review these plans as well and provide feedback and know your codes well enough that they can cross-reference and make sure that these plans are indeed meeting your codes.
So this is one thing that, I've thought about. We're all lay people. We don't know how to read, blueprints and engineer reports and all this, that, and the other. And I always, concerned, we get these reports, we get these, all this paperwork and everything. And it's like, we're supposed to approve this. I mean, we're relying on like engineers and, city officials and this sort, that and the other. And, sometimes I feel like we're just stamping it, you know what I mean? Because we're relying on everybody else to tell us, oh yeah, that's good, sign it, kind of.
Right.
Well, that's what I want to say. What I try to do, or if these come up, what I will probably try to do before every planning commission meeting is to give my own recommendation of to what I see, if I see any possible problems or any issues. And on top of that, if at any time anybody gets these, when we pass out the package, if at any time anybody on the planning commission wants to come by and go over it with me, I'm more than happy to do that anytime. Because I do understand, I mean, they can be a little confusing to read sometimes. And I mean, it's slightly easier for me, but only because I've been looking at them for 23 years. So, I mean, or somewhere around in there. So, I mean, it makes it, that's like just, I don't know, reading a sentence for me, but it's different for somebody else. I couldn't begin to tell Karen how to do realty stuff. That's way past me. But it's just, some people are trained in certain ways. And so if at any time we get some of this, and if we want to have like a preliminary planning commission meeting or something, just for me to explain what we're looking at, I'd be more than happy to do that at any time.
Now I'm going to jump in here. Very last thing that we'll be talking about is just the role of the planning commissioner and looking at the packets and all of that. But since you brought it up, I'll say that, never be afraid to just say, in the meeting, now, can you explain, what am I looking at here? What is this? That's exactly what you ought to be doing. And you are put on the planning commission, I imagine, partly because you're not an engineer or an architect. You are a layperson. You come from different backgrounds, a whole variety. And so part of that is, can you explain to me what I'm looking at? And help me visualize it. And I think that it's not just appropriate, it should be done. So, and we'll get into more of that too. So,
Good point.
Yeah, like, so last week we approved a lot split, and there's a swimming pool over here and there's a fence, and they're splitting the lot between fences or whatever, and we have to approve it. We're looking at a survey, and I'm like, okay, Jeremy, did it meet the the parameters, the setback lines? And I mean, yeah, I can look at surveys and read them, but anyway, so I'm relying on other professionals to give their advice to us as to what we're looking at.
I think it's supposed to be that way in some regards, honestly, Karen. I don't have an expectation of the planning commissioners to know what a set of blueprints or drawings would look like. I don't know about you guys, Susan or Bernadette. I think the planning commission is supposed to come from a set of varied backgrounds. The people who are made up of the community, who keep in mind the spirit and intent of the code. That's my perception. And so I would never put that, I don't have that on. I think the more you do it, obviously, the more experience you're going to get at it, but that's, I would expect to leave that up to Jeremy. And then just like Susan said, let's be honest.
And that the fact that it's a public meeting with a diverse group of people from different backgrounds, it's transparent in your decision making. It's absolutely appropriate to get that professional input so that you know what to look for. But really your role is to prepare for the meeting, read the packet, read the recommendations, have a working knowledge of the code, and hopefully through these 3 sessions we've given you a little bit more confidence in being able to look up the information that you need. But that's that's sufficient. That's a good faith effort to understand the decisions you're making. All right. Well, I know we're an hour into and we have a lot more to cover, so I'm going to just really quickly summarize the subdivision process. And again, we kind of went over this, but I just thought it was interesting to pull out how many different stakeholders are reviewing and involved in a development review like this. So, you're not alone, planning commissioners, and also Jeremy, you're not alone. You have backup and help, and with your fire chief or your fire marshal, with your, your utility providers. So, but relying on them too to double check the proposal against their standards. Okay, so we will move on, unless there are any other questions about subdivision. We will move on to our special topics in planning, and we have 3 of them for you. Susan is going to cover annexation and historic districts, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about flood prevention. So,
Okay,
Susan.
I'm going to take off my watch where I can look at it here. For some years, I think cities were annexing, just kind of willy-nilly annexing property, and it kind of got a bad name. And there was a period of time where planners were actively discouraging that kind of annexation. But annexation is appropriate, in some cases. And for example, if the area around your city is beginning to urbanize, beginning to develop, maybe there's land that hasn't been developed yet, but it's just really ripe for developing, it's going to happen, you should probably think about making it part of your community. If your city is already providing city services to an area outside your city limits, then by all means, it's time to annex. And I'll just make a little note here. Please don't do that. Don't provide services to an area that you have not annexed.
So
Yeah.
I don't mean to, I know you talked about time a second ago. I don't want to dragging this out. To what urgency are you speaking, Susan? We do have a few areas that extend out. We have a water line actually that goes almost 2.5, 3 miles outside the city limit. And there's a handful of residences attached to it. It's probably been that way for
forever.
Yeah.
Forever. Okay, so the issue is that, and this has happened in some other communities, they extend the services, kind of assuming that eventually they can annex those neighbors in. But there's no incentive for them to want to be annexed. And in some cases, the community will say, we need to annex you and another area because the time is appropriate. And they're like, no, of course not. And it's just, it can get very, very snarled, all of a sudden. Now, this is something you've extended the services for a while. If the area is continuing to develop, I think, yeah, you should probably look at it. And that's really the key phrase here is look at it. Do an annexation study. MetroPlan has done several. There's been two where I've been tangentially involved, and at least 2 others that I know about. They're fairly straightforward. Work closely with the city to this, and you take into a lot of considerations, but really at base, you're looking at your existing revenues and existing expenses, and you're comparing that to what you project would be the revenues and expenses if you add an area. And there are other considerations as well, and I've just listed just some typical kinds of revenues and expenses. It's a study that requires a lot of detail work, and again, working closely with the city, as we should, but it's a fairly straightforward kind of thing. There's some trickier questions involved. Will additional personnel be required? Maybe, for administration. will annexing trigger the need to upgrade your water, your sewer streets, either in the new portion or maybe even in your city now? And I have a story for you. That's one of the advantages to having worked here for 28 years. You accumulate a lot of stories. But the little community, unincorporated area of Gravel Ridge, sat right between Jacksonville and Sherwood, did not want to be annexed, but was going to be annexed to one of those two cities. The city of Jacksonville, and I think I'm correct in this number, set aside $3 million for drainage upgrades. They knew that would be needed if Gravel Ridge came in with Jacksonville. While this was going on, it was held by election. And while this was going on, there was just some torrential rain. I don't know if you remember, it was several years ago, but flooding. And some of the public service people just got in their car and drove around. And they came back just shaking their heads and saying, you know, you should have set aside at least double that amount. Well, ultimately, Gravel Ridge made the decision to be annexed by Sherwood. And although, I mean, obviously no one in Jacksonville would have said anything because it would have sounded like sour grapes, but I think there's a prevalent feeling among many people in Jacksonville that maybe the city dodged a bullet in that case because of the tremendous upgrades that would be needed. That's just one example, but you do need to consider that, what would it need? And then, and this is one that you probably would already have a handle on, but do you anticipate any resistance among the property owners? I said likely. It's possible if they are already receiving the services and they may say, well, what's in it for us? Maybe not. And I'll point out too that we're talking about property owners, not the residents, you know, not the renters. So you're dealing here with property owners. Okay, so you've done your study, you've thought about it, considered it, and decided to move forward. So you can go two ways. You can go by petition or by election. This is just a very quick overview, but in the packet of material that Bernadette has that she'll send out either tomorrow or Monday, there are a couple of tables that go into great detail about both petitioning and by election, spells out exactly who is responsible for what and any kind of time constrictions that you may have. I will just tell you, petition is much easier. You've already got resident buy-in. You need 51%. And again, it says residents you need 51%, but we're talking property owners that you need that 51%. Metro Plan has got sample petitions, sample ordinances. We've got it all. Just ask. Election is a lot more time consuming. You definitely want to tie it to a regular election date, November 4 election date, or else you're talking about a whole lot of even, you know, more time. It's costlier. There's a lot more public outreach involved. You're not entirely sure of the outcome, and yet that still may be the thing to do sometimes. It just depends, and you'll see that in the table. Can I ask you, are you considering annexing? Is that something that's on the horizon for the city?
Not in particular. I would say it's not necessarily a particular priority, but there are, when you said a minute ago, it needs to be considered and thought through. If we set aside some time to talk about annexation, particularly here in Lonoke, we would have some areas of focus that need to be considered for sure.
And that's exactly the order that you need to do it in.
I think we've got some higher priorities to tackle first.
Yeah.
I had a question just to clarify. I just want to verify. When you're saying residents 51%, you're talking about residents in the entire town, not just residents in the area you're annexing.
No, residents in the area that want to be annexed.
Okay. I just wanted clarification on that because I wasn't sure which way it went.
Right.
When you extend city boundaries, it has to be contiguous too, right?
That's correct. That is correct. And I didn't put that down, but very often what will trigger a city wanting to annex is that they start seeing subdivisions pop up just outside the city limits. There'll be requests for city services. Or they'll see some land that's just really ripe for development. You know it's going to develop. You'd like to be able to have a little bit of say-so about it. So there you go. But you're telling me that there's nothing that's really urgent going on. So I just offer this to you for your future consideration. And always, as always, Metro Plan is. Did I put that down there? No. Metro Plan is a resource for that, as is the Municipal League. Over to you, Bernadette.
Thank you. So, Mayor Reed, you asked to cover flood management a little bit, flood prevention, and this is not my area of expertise, but I know I in my research I discovered that you have a flood prevention ordinance, and so I thought, well, that's a great place to start because you have something in place that you're already administering and talking to people about. So let's focus on that. But what we did find was that, there are really 4 parts of flood management. There's mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And ideally, you're trying to focus on the first 2, right? So that your response and your recovery get a whole lot easier or can be avoided altogether. And I believe really that's what your flood damage prevention code does. So you're on the right path already. And feel free, if there are certain questions or examples that you'd like to bring up about flood prevention, certainly bring those up. I'm going to go over just a few. I'm just going to pull out a few key components of the ordinance that stuck out to me that I just wanted to make you aware of. And but feel free to bring up individual cases that we might need to talk about. But really, you're on the right path because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so if you can make sure that developments in your floodplain areas are done correctly, you can really avoid a lot of bad results down the line. So the first thing that this code addresses is, when does it kick in? And it applies to special flood hazard areas as defined by FEMA. So there's really not much guesswork. It's all laid out on the FEMA floodplain maps. And there's the link right there where you can pull those up. And I have to thank Ms. Ibbotson. She provided that link to me, and I was very quickly able to find the map, and we'll send you the image of the map, which is a very high resolution image, in your packet after the meeting today. And so that's just good to have in your back pocket so you know where the floodplains are. Of course, it's not just one floodplain. There are all these subcategories and special things. So it gets a little complicated after that. But it does apply, this ordinance applies to any kind of new construction, relocation of buildings, substantial alterations to buildings, and changes to use in your floodplain areas, in your special flood hazard areas.
I want to add to that real quick because we've had to deal with some floodplain issues recently and in the past year. And I use this image to talk about drainage with the Corps of Engineers. This is a 2006 map. So this map is 13 years old, I think. And they've got another product they're building, but it's not official. And the new map that is the unofficial floodplain, the firm will be used for the firm, which is the insurance rate map, is it has that floodplain has found its way more into our community than you can anticipate. And so in reality, our floodplain is much worse than what you're looking at, but this is the map. This is the official map that we have to technically make decisions off of until that firm is updated.
That is a really good point, Mayor, because things are constantly changing, and it does need to be updated. And so you can only work off of the map that you officially have from FEMA, but you can probably drive around your community and know that that's not completely up to date anymore. And actually, in the ordinance, it does give the floodplain administrator some this, I don't want to say discretion, but authority to interpret the map if it's not completely clear on where the boundaries are. It's up to the floodplain administrator to review. And then that person, who I believe is it still Ms. Ibbotson, that's the floodplain administrator and issues those
Yes.
permits.
And
That
after Jeremy's been here for 10 years, maybe he could take that over.
yeah. Probably a dubious honor. So
I hear that's
title,
I was told that's one of the hardest tests or certifications to gain in the state. Is what I was told. It's very tough.
Yeah, I'm kind of scared of that one.
And so then you might see appeals if, Ms. Ibbotson denies a permit and then that person appeals, it will go to you, the planning commission. And then if they don't like your decision, it will go to court. So that's kind of the process for and the accountability for that.
And I don't want to confuse the planning commissioners, but Regina is not certified. She's just our appointed floodplain administrator. She works with Leanne Poole at CAPDD locally, who is a certified floodplain manager. So that's how rural communities work. She's, like I said, she's smart on it, but she's not the definitive voice locally, the local expert, I guess.
So Regina can get with Leanne on any questions. And okay, that's good to know. Okay, I wanted to pull out a few key definitions that, even as I was reading through this, I had to go back to the definitions in the ordinance and make sure I was understanding what exactly they were referring to. But it talks a lot about special flood hazard areas, because those are those areas that are identified in blue on the map. And those are the geographical areas that FEMA has identified as being at risk for flooding. Now within that, there are various flood risk zones, A, AE, AH, AO. And so you really have to go through and see the development standards for each zone within the floodplain. And what the requirements are for a building gaining a permit in those zones. The base flood elevation is otherwise known as the 100-year flood elevation, which is officially defined as, if it's 100 years, you have a 0.1% chance of flooding in any given year. However, like the mayor just said, we put this disclaimer here at the bottom because the 100-year flood idea can be very misleading, because that makes you think, oh, it only happens once every 100 years. Well, it could be a lot more often than every 100 years, or it could be less often. It's really not a definitive measure. And like you said, with having to update the firm, the floodplain, due to climate change or other factors, could be expanding and extending itself in your area. So there are, of course, just based on natural conditions, regular changes in the actual base flood elevation versus what's on the map. So just something to be aware of. The general requirements is that's listed in your ordinance is that construction methods and materials have to be used that will reduce flood damage. So knowing that floods do happen, when they do happen, that you've got materials in place that can withstand that better. Critical facilities, and I'd have to look up what the definition of critical facilities is, but they have to even be held to a higher standard, and they have to exceed the 500-year flood protection standards. Basement foundations are not allowed in the floodplain. And any enclosed area below the first floor, like a crawl space or a parking structure, has to be designed to let water in and out. And utilities have to be elevated or protected from the BFE, the base flood elevation. And developments are required to provide drainage and evacuation plans. So again, that's working towards your mitigation and your preparedness factors. And in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time on this other than to say that there are various risk zones. They have different definitions where, the AE risk zone, where FEMA studies have determined the exact base flood elevation in that zone. Other risk zones are not regular flooders. They have shallow flooding, or they might have shallow flooding with sheet flow. So it all gets very technical. And for something that has to do with water, it's very dry. So I wouldn't. I would just try to get a working understanding of what's listed in there and what the requirements are. I've summarized them here, but I would encourage you to just give that ordinance a read through so that you can start to tie it all together. Mayor or anybody else, Karen, do you have any other comments or questions or examples of floodplain development that you'd like to talk about? And we can get back to this, you know, if you have a case that comes up or a questionable permit or anything like that, just get back with us. And if we don't know the answer, we'll find someone who does. All right, on to a much happier topic.
Oh, for me anyway. Before I start, let me tell you, I have all night, and Bernadette has a good part of the night, but I'm assuming that you all have other things to do, so I'm going to be going through these next few sections pretty quickly. Don't be afraid to stop, or if you want more information later, give me a call, send us an email, however you want, but I'm going to be going pretty quickly here. I loved some of your comments at the beginning of this session. We asked about your ideal neighborhood. We got things like no spec houses, not cookie cutter, variety, no sprawl, liking to see the American flag snapping, you know, in the breeze, pedestrian scale, those kinds of things. Those are all things that I think a historic district should do. Now, in the interest of transparency, I live in a historic district on purpose. I serve on a historic district commission, and you know, back when the Earth Trust was cooling, my graduate degree was in community planning with the emphasis area in historic preservation. Am I biased? Well, that would be for you to judge, but here we go. I think there are some potential benefits to creating and administering an historic district. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll go through a couple. Property values increase. This is a true thing that has been pretty consistent all across the nation, is that property values, and in times of economic housing turn down, they are stable. So, you know, even at the worst, they remain stable, and at best, they tend to increase. Your investments stay local. I'll mention that labor tends to be local. Materials that are brought in tend to be local or regional. Tourism. A couple of things about tourism. Most of you know that the Metro Plan Board of Directors has set aside, I think it's $55 million over 10 years for the construction of a regional bike trail. Lonoke County is just darn near ideal for cycling. And bicyclists have disposable income. While they're biking, they like to stop, get some refreshments, but more important, they look around, and when they come back later with their SUVs and their families, and they spend more money and take things home with them. That's one aspect that's really on the horizon for you. Another is that tourism, I believe I'm correct with this figure, 40% of all tourism is made up of people who visit historic sites in historic districts. Now that 40% is really a coveted demographic because they tend to be slightly older, they stay longer, they have a lot more disposable income. And you also don't have other issues to deal with, like picking up trash after a big event. You know, they don't have those kinds of expenses. Business recruitment, that's quality of life. Tax credits, I've used tax credits personally for my house. They're available for commercial use. I'm not an expert on them, but I know that commercial districts can get up to 25% back on investments they make. I'm going to skip over here. Y'all familiar with HGTV and Hometown with Aaron and Ben? They talk a lot about environmental stewardship. I'm not sure if they've ever actually used that word, but when you think about what's good for the environment, what do we say? We say reuse, recycle, repurpose, and that's what they're all about. And that's what preserving our historic buildings. That's what it's all about, is keeping those things. And we do keep that record. It is a record of ourselves and our communities. I think it gives people a sense of rootedness to their area. And several times I tried to write down who said what, but I know that several people have mentioned the little subdivisions and the cookie cutter subdivisions. You don't have that with, you know, historic areas. They're unique. Each area is unique. There is no one size fits all. I think the other thing, and I put this down because it's what I personally believe, so I'm going to let you know. I think it's a good thing that people, and especially younger people, learn that not everything is or should be disposable in our culture, that there are things worth keeping. And that's my elevator speech. Having said, pardon, okay. Having said that, there are some things to consider. Do you have community support, or can you raise community support? Do you have the administrative capability? Yeah, well, you need additional personnel. There's an enforcement element and training. The training would be for personnel and for community as well. There's a lot of support you can get for that. Just something to consider. If you choose to, or if you want to explore it, you're not committing to anything, but the whole process is outlined in the Arkansas Code. If you were to do that, the mayor would appoint a historic district commission, and it would be ratified by the council. It would really function pretty much like a planning commission. In fact, it ought to work pretty closely with a planning commission. Y'all ought to know what you're doing. You get help by a study that is done by the city with the help of historic preservation. City council adopts it. Again, these are things to consider. Is it worth it? You do have resources. I did not list myself, although I'd be tickled to talk to you about it. The department, the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program is a division of Arkansas Heritage. And as I said, they've got everything you would ever want to know. They've got plenty of personnel that would be happy to go out, talk to you, to help you with a study, to help conduct the study, and step you all the way through it. I just wanted to make this, and the reason I wanted to talk about preservation is because every time I go to Lonoke, which isn't often enough, I'm really struck by the assets that you have, and I would hate to see anything happen. But that's, as I said, that's my very short presentation on heritage. Okay, then I'm just going to go barreling right into laws and ethics. So, a few words on case law. The things I'm going to be talking to you about, there's 75, 85 years of case law. And if you were to plow through all of that, you know, it would just be hair-raising. As Bernadette and I talked about this, we prepared for it. We decided that practically speaking, the Planning Commission isn't going to have to deal with any of that. There are a few things that, yes, you need to be aware of, and that's what I'm going to talk about. But I did want to mention that some of these things can get incredibly complicated. Starting with the law. We talk about the First Amendment, Freedom of Information Act, the Fifth Amendment, and Title VI just very, very briefly. All of these are pretty much, consider it like a ball of yarn, and we're just kind of teasing out a few of the elements to talk about. First Amendment, obviously there's your first ball of yarn. It's just that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, protects freedom of speech and of the press. And it seems like it's such a simple, straightforward thing. And there is, I believe this is true, there is more case law pertaining to the First Amendment than any of the other amendments. The Fifth, and I believe even the 14th Amendment. So in 2000, I think who would that have been? President Clinton signed into law the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. This was a controversial law. The American Planning Association opposed it. So did a number of other planning organizations, Urban League. There is case law. It has not gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and many of the cases were actually settled outside of court, so it's a little thin. So I'm just going to cut right to the chase. You tread lightly with religious institutions, but don't just cave. You have city policies pertaining to, for example, sidewalks, parking, whatever. Mostly what you're going to be dealing with churches is issues of parking, signage, and then uses like they want to add a daycare or elder care or something like that, some kind of ancillary use. Those are the three primary things that you'll be looking at. Again, case law is pretty thin on it. Often what you'll have is a church asking for a variance on a sidewalk requirement because they need that space for visitor parking. If the church is in an established area, there are sidewalks, the city is well within its rights to deny that. I would suggest deny it, but look for some alternative. Is there another place they could use? One city, and I want to say it was Hot Springs, but I'm not positive, so I should probably take that back. Mm-hmm. But the city offered one of its own parking lots that was very nearby to use instead of. Signage is a little easier because with signage, I mean, a church doesn't need a sign in order to exercise its freedom of religion, in order to worship. So if you have a sign that is regulated, you can still regulate the size of it. If it's a message sign, one of those electronic things, you can regulate the brightness and all of that. Ancillary uses, probably the question that would come up would be traffic. Like, would a daycare add a whole lot more traffic? And that is something that should fall outside the scope of the Religious Land Use Act. Where cities have gotten in trouble is where they've actually tried to impose conditions that they would not impose on some other use. And very often, and I don't know about your zoning ordinance, but very often a church is a conditional use. It's permitted by conditional use in a lot of zones. So you're already, in a sort of a negotiating frame of mind there. The other thing I would say about religion is that, of course, all faiths are treated the same. If you have an ordinance that pertains to the placement of a church, that holds whether it's a church, a cathedral, a synagogue, or a mosque, whatever it is. You can't court trouble by trying to regulate what faith goes where. I know that not so much in Lonoke County, but I know Saline County has got a really significant minority, but a significant minority of Hindus, and they have a worship center there, and from all accounts, very good neighbors. Freedom of speech, there's one that going through case law is just, curled my hair for me. But that's not typically what a planning commission has to deal with, is all of the little subtleties. Mostly you're looking at signs, placement of some sort of unsavory business, like, a sex shop, and then public comments. So for signs, same thing. Obscenity, you cannot, you can regulate that. That's established case law. You do not have to give somebody the right to publish something that is pornographic or obscene on a billboard. But as long as they stay within the framework in the ordinance, they can say a lot of things. And you can just ask the city of Harrison, which has had to deal with some signs that, according to the city's Chamber of Commerce, has really hurt the business. You just have to really be aware of that. Hate speech is typically, it's not permitted. The state does not have a state law against hate speech. There's one that's coming up. I don't know what the status of that is, but there are federal laws. So you have that at your disposal too, if someone wants something that's unsavory. The other thing you can do, and really should do, is for political signs. After a campaign is over, like say within 35 or 45 days, the signs need to go. In individual neighborhoods, they can regulate signage much more stringently if they have a property owners association. That's something that's outside the planning commission. This one again, your zoning ordinance probably deals with it already. As long as you put them in the zone, and appropriate signage would be applicable there. But those are primarily the two issues that you'd have to deal with as a planning commission. Now the other is public comment, and I'm getting into the role of the planning commissioner. It is your meeting, and you make the rules, and the rules can be that courtesy. It's one thing, going back to religion, it's one thing for people to oppose placement of a church because of, say, traffic concerns, safety concerns. That's perfectly legitimate, should be considered. It is not legitimate for, or to be listened to, for someone to say they don't want that church because they don't like Catholics. And the Planning Commission is under no obligation to tolerate that sort of talk. Also with public comment, I may be getting ahead of myself. If you have an issue where a lot of people are turning out, they have a right to be heard, but you have a right to limit the number of people and the amount of time. So if 45 people are going to make the same point, you can hear from, for 3 of them or 5 of them if they're making the same point. And then the chairperson could say, does someone want to speak on this issue that has a different point to make? And that's perfectly fine. You're still giving. What I would do if it's a really hot issue is, if people have other comments, they can write them down, and you've taken care of it. So you do, as planning commissioners, you do have the right to control the public comment, as long as you're giving people the right to be heard. Freedom of the press, this is so straightforward. Arkansas has a Freedom of Information Act. This was a grassroots effort that came out of a series of scandals. I wasn't living here then, but apparently there were a number of scandals in the 1960s that came out where there was a lot of like secret meetings and under the table kinds of stuff. And the Arkansas FOIA is what came out of that. It has never been expanded. It has had a few extra exemptions added to it. I think initially there were 11, there may be like 15 now, but not very many. And it is, according to a recent study, it is still one of the country's most expansive and sunshine laws. It is one of the most liberal of the sunshine laws, and that's just a fact. You get these handy little books that are published. This is the 19th edition, which is still in effect. It gives Arkansans access to public records, public meetings, public input. It covers records and it covers public meetings, those two things. Records can include email, correspondence. It covers working papers, expense, budget, video, audio, sticky notes, memoranda. And I say sticky notes because a city council, the city I will not name because I can't remember which one it was, but it was when I was here. I don't know what the issue was, but what they did is they would give the packet to the press, but then would turn off their mics and pass notes, pass sticky notes, and then turn the mic back on. Well, guess what? All of that was FOIable. And so they learned a kind of nothing terrible. There was nothing nefarious going on, but it was embarrassing. There were some embarrassing notes that had been passed. And it was just done to try to get around something. There's, I think, as I said, 11 or 15 exemptions. Those include obviously things like medical and school records. Archaeological sites are covered, you know, because of thievery, grand jury records, undercover police, you know, fairly obvious things. So you have 3 business days to comply, and you do not have to create a document. I think that's something that people don't know. As far as a planning commission meeting goes, which is really what you're dealing with, 2 really magic responses. One is a magic question, which is, are you on deadline? And the press person will love you. If you don't know an answer, say, I don't know, but I'll find out, and then find out. Make sure that the packet that you have is available in full to a member of the press. I was once asked that question, what do they have that I don't have? And fortunately, I was able to say, you have everything, plus you have a roster of committee members and their contact information. So you may be asked that. Notice that it also applies to working papers. That can be really aggravating. I would suggest developing a really good working relationship with the press. And we've never been troubled by that. But there it is.
We have about 10 minutes left.
Oh my gosh,
Oh, no.
I'm going to just swing through this. Takings, most of the time you will never have to deal with a takings issue because that is the job of the highway department, and it's usually like if they need right of way. So the only issue that would come up would be what is fair market value, and that's a negotiation. Over the years, takings has also come to mean if through a regulation, a city ordinance, a city zoning regulation, someone feels that they've been deprived of using their property the way they should. And here there's just 4 rules about takings that you have. I'm not really going to go over those. I'm trying to think of an example where you might have to deal with one. It's possible, and I would suggest that your first phone call be to the municipal league.
Susan, we have one really good example in town. No action's been taken on it, but if there were a home, we have a residence that's actually sitting on top of a drainage pipe.
Oh.
And this pipe has been it's a municipal drainage watershed, and Over the years, it's caused lots of issues. It's washed out this lady's backyard consistently. What needs to happen is the city needs to confiscate this property and open up that drainage swell, because whoever buys this house is going to be consistently dealing with these drainage considerations. And we've done what we can to a point, which put big swell rocks up against it to stop the washing out of it, because literally her backyard is sitting, they filled it in, right? So she's on top of about a 5 or 6 foot diameter drainage pipe that goes right under her yard and out on the other
Her
side.
yard,
Her
not
backyard.
the house, but the yard.
Yeah. There used to be a big ditch in her yard, and it's been piped and filled in, and without appropriate rock and everything around it. So we've done the best we could to fix it. My point is, that's a good example we have in town of a property that might be considered for what's considered, I assume.
Eminent domain. So in which case the city could, pursue that. You'd want to start informally. I don't know if this lady has lived there forever, and you'll have to, take her out feet first if that's the issue.
Well, her house recently caught on fire conveniently, so she moved back to North Little Rock. I don't know where the status of the home is right now, but it seems like the roof has been repaired, and I think it's going to be on the market soon. There's been no formal conversation, so I'm not alluding to anything, so please don't read into my message.
Oh, of course not. No. And I'd have to, I'm kind of thinking about that as we go. The fact that it's no longer usable in the property, I think that would be the ideal time is to exercise eminent domain, and then you get into issues of fair market value, and then you just be in a negotiating situation. So that may be, I hate to think of a house being a house burning down being a good thing, but that may have cleared the way, and that's a good case of where you could get into a taking. It may not even, a taking would be something that would be alleged by the person that you're exercising eminent domain over. They may or may not say it's a taking. If you offer the money, then that's, all good, and she may be very glad to get that. I'd like to follow up on that. I know that we're running short on time, but that's really interesting. And it's not in the right of way. That's not part of your right of way.
I don't want to speak too much because I don't have all the details.
Okay.
I'm just campaigning.
Okay.
Please don't read into it. For the planning commissioners, I spoke to it as one example that really comes to mind in Lonoke, and it's only one resident. However, there was a lot of issues in her backyard that nobody else in town has to deal with, and all the water is going right under her backyard and taking lots of dirt with it. And it could be a real consideration. So the city, I think the best interest and the best outcome would be for the city to somehow occupy that property, remediate the home, and open it back up to an open lot, and let the water run freely, turn it into a park maybe. But
it's really doable. And obviously we're not going to maybe publicizing this, but yeah, that's fair. That is really interesting. And I like the sign. I think Bernie actually found this: beware of, just beware. But practically speaking, anything that you do here would be done, with proper advice. Okay, Title VI. The only thing I'm going to mention about Title VI is that the city has a non-discrimination statement. I haven't seen it. This happens to be Metro Plan's non-discrimination statement. The only thing as far as the Planning Commission is when you have meetings, make sure to have the notice of non-discrimination posted somewhere where it can be seen. So wherever you have your meetings, just have it posted.
Ms. Regina advised me that it is posted in City Hall, but it might be good to put it in the meeting room as well, where you're meeting, once you do have in-person meetings again.
Yeah, when that happens, that's just a little tip, like the space bar, Okay. Good resources here. The American Planning Association and Arkansas Municipal League. American Planning Association can give you everything you ever wanted to know about taking. They can get very specific. You can call and have very specific conversations. They're happy to help. Ethics, okay. When we talk about ethics, we're not talking about, people know when they're taking money under the table or when they're advancing an agenda so they can make money. It's not about your ethics as a planning commissioner. It's how it's perceived. W.I. Thomas in 1928, he's an educated at University of Tennessee, but developed something called the Thomas Theorem, which is that if people define situations as real, the consequences will be real. So, you know, it's how you're perceived as much as anything. And then about 10 years later, Ella Fitzgerald said it a little, with a little more rhythm. She said, "Tain't what you do, it's the way that you do it." So APA has an entire statement for planning commissioners and people in planning, and this is just an excerpt from it. Bernadette's going to include the full thing, but this really kind of gets to the heart of it. We're talking about ethics, consistency, and non-discrimination. You've heard that several times before. Handling interactions outside of meetings. That one I do want to mention for about 45 seconds here. When you're in the church coffee hour or you're in the grocery store and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, you know, about this rezoning that you've got scheduled," you want to do two things. You want to validate that person. Say, "I'm so glad you're interested in this. Come to the meeting," or, you know, call. And then say, "Obviously, I can't talk to you about it because I'm on the planning commission, but here's the person you need to contact." And I would go so far as to have like a 3x5 card that has the website, city's website, and the name and phone number of who they need to be calling. That way you've done two things. You've validated them, you've encouraged public participation, and you've made it, you know, obvious to that person and to everyone around you that you can't talk to them because you are on the planning commission. Are we about done? Do you want to stop now, or what is your feeling? I don't want to go past the time, or
Let's see, we've got these situations, and then we're done with ethics, and then there's the planning commissioner's role.
yeah.
Why don't you read through the situation number 1, and then kind of see if anyone can guess the answer. Oh, now you got way ahead. Hang on. Let me get the keyboard out. Click off of that.
Okay, well, the first one was about the annual birthday dinner. I don't know if y'all read that, but the annual birthday dinner, there it was. Okay, so you're appointed to the planning commission. You chair the committee that's charged with selecting a consultant to update the comprehensive plan. Your best friend, your best friends, your spouses are best friends. And he calls and says, "Hey, let's get together for your annual dinner date. This is something you do every year." But you hesitate. What do you do?
Because he owns
owns the
planning firm.
owns the largest planning firm and is a strong contender for that contract. So what do? Again, this is assuming that everybody concerned is acting in good faith. Nobody has anything nefarious in mind. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Personally, I say if you've been doing it for years, there's no problem with having the meeting. But in the event of trying to keep someone from calling conflict, I would say B, in this situation, you might want to politely decline the offer just to avoid any controversy. For any accusation of controversy, I should say.
Right. And again, we're talking about people who are acting in good faith, and so that's one possibility. There's another issue, and that is that this person is on a committee that's going to select the firm. So I would suggest that your friend, the planning commissioner should cite possible conflict of interest because he's good friends with one of the contenders, and step down from that committee, and then wait until after the contract is awarded, then have the dinner, or even have the dinner, but then in any event, the planning commissioner is going to have to recuse himself or herself when it comes down to the vote, because there's that, your friend is up for the award, or for the contract. But you see what I mean? It's not so easy, because especially in smaller communities, but even in big communities, people run in tight circles. But it's you go back to the Thomas theorem that if somebody sees that, even if everything was absolutely above board, it's like, oh well, you you just don't. It's something you want to avoid. So that's kind of the short version.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is, if there's any question, the safest bet is always to cite that, be upfront about that potential conflict of interest, and then recuse yourself.
You get transparency.
And the other, transparency, exactly. And the other point is, if it's something that you have a clear conflict of interest with, or you are the applicant, as a planning commissioner, leave the room when they're discussing your application.
That's the other point. That is the other thing. You not only say, I have a conflict, you recuse yourself, and you leave the room. And is it absolutely necessary? I suppose not, but it is highly advisable to do that. Nobody's going to say anything about that. Okay, yeah, let me just scoot through here. I'm not going to do the second one, except to say that everybody should read the planning study. Once it becomes a basis for decision, then the planning commissioners need to read it. And going back to the Arkansas Freedom of Information Act, somebody could even force the issue. But I would say that alternatives B or C would be, or A, B, or C actually would be perfectly reasonable. And those are some of your ethics resources. And again, Bernadette has more information. We already talked about some of this. Your meeting preparation, the packet, and Jeremy would have a staff report in there. And I would just say, read it. There's nothing worse than going into a meeting and seeing a planning commissioner or whoever come out, they open their packet while they're at the meeting. Site visits are terrific. However, one caution, if you go as a group for a site visit, that is a meeting, and you have to notify media. But I would strongly encourage, even if you just drive by, just get a feel for it. Quorum, you cannot have a proxy vote. You can't have planning counselors sit in for a planning commissioner. You can't have a proxy vote. You want to try to have a quorum if at all possible, because many times there's money at stake, for a developer. And although you're not in the business of helping a developer make money, you also don't want to cost anybody any money. Meeting management, one thing I wanted to say about motions, very, very often you'll hear a discussion and then the chairman will ask for a motion and someone will say, so moved. That's permitted, but more often now, organizations, planners, and municipal leagues, historic districts, all of those are they're advising that motions be much more specific, so that you are citing the reasons why you're moving to approve or moving to deny. If you move to deny based on this, and this. And that is simply to document and have a very clear record of it. This is something that has come about just within the last 5 years. It's been an emerging trend. You want to be absolutely consistent. If you have a set way of doing things where you maybe make the motion and then discuss, or in my commission, we discuss, open it to the public, and then make a motion, and then there can be other discussion. That's fine, but you shouldn't vary it. Public comment, I've already talked about public comment, and transparency in all things. If you are transparent about what you're doing, and document every little thing. More cases have been lost because somebody just, well, example, 14-day public comment. If it's 13 days, you've automatically lost. There you go. So document and follow those rules. That's the planning commissioner's role, and I would say ask questions, which we already talked about that. Hey, you're a planning commissioner. Ask those questions. Explain it to me. And that's all I have. And I thank you so much for your time.
Yes. Thank you, Susan. I know that was just a sprint.
real train.
And I'm just going to sprint through these slides because I'm not going to quiz y'all on this because we do not have time for that tonight. But where do we go from here? If there are additional topics that we haven't covered, or if you're even interested in a topic we have covered but want more detail, a more in-depth seminar on something like annexation or historic districts, or even meeting management, just let us know, and we can always do this again. And census or technical assistance, we do lots of things at MetroPlan, and I think I've already provided you with a full list, but now with the new census data coming in, if you have any needs for redistricting, we can help with that. We can, of course, help with annexation studies and model ordinances, not just the big one we're developing, but smaller ones like for food trucks. We can help with those kind of model ordinances as well. So just email, Karen, Mayor, Jeremy, all of you, you know how to get a hold of me. You have my email. Please do get in touch. That's our little thank you. We appreciate your time. This has been a great experience for us. And we hope you've found it of value to yourself and your own confidence level and your own feeling of comfort and confidence with the zoning and subdivision ordinances. There's always more to discuss, and we'd be happy to go down that road with you. But please know that we're not going anywhere. We're here as your partner in all things transportation and planning. So please do keep in touch with us and let us know what else you need from us.
Thank you so much, Susan and Bernadette, for your time and your knowledge, and we appreciate you spending so much time with us, and we've really learned a lot. Y'all been very informative.
Really
Thank you,
enjoyed it.
Karen.
We absolutely enjoyed it.
We love this group. You guys are great to work with, and we wish you all the best. Just let us know what you need from us. We're here for you.
I feel like I'm at the end of a milkshake. There's no more. You keep slurping the straw, but it's gone.
Oh, there's always more.
I've given you guys enough praise and thanks, but I mean it. I really do appreciate you guys. It's 8 o'clock and you guys are I'm guessing in Little Rock, and you're still in your offices, and you guys are giving us your attention, and it means a lot. And I really appreciate that. And it's definitely going to pay dividends in our community. And now it's up to the Planning Commission to take all this information and exercise it and use it, and put it in play, put it into practice. So I'm looking
We can't
forward.
hold a candle to the planning commissioners because you are all volunteers doing this out of love for your community. So thank you for your commitment, and don't give up the good fight.
Bye.
You all have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Bye.
See you guys.